How's everybody doing this morning? Who liked the fact that there was snow coming down this morning? Wow, that was more than I expected. Who was like, anybody? Okay. All right. Thanks for being honest this morning. We practiced honesty here at the church. We're in the final 2 weeks of our series called Beginnings, and we've been following the Israelites through the story of Exodus, Leviticus, and we're into Numbers right now. And it's been a lot like looking at a mirror. If you've been reading along or been a part of our services over the last 5 or 6 weeks, you start reading their story and you realize this is kind of my story too. They struggled with trusting the Lord. They fought with each other. They didn't know how to deal with leadership. They ran into many obstacles along the way, and they had difficulty trusting that God was going to come through on His promises. Can you relate to any of those things in your life? And so it's just like reading our own story as we read through the story of the Israelites. And God remained faithful through all of it to provide a way forward. For those who put their hope and their trust in Him, He provided a way forward. And that's kind of a theme that we've seen through this entire series, is God's faithfulness in the midst of our wanderings. I am grateful for that today. For the number of times, for the hundreds of times that God has met me in my wandering. I'm grateful that God will put us in the right place at the right time with the right people to be able to speak into our lives, whether that's here on a Sunday or at work or through just a random conversation with a friend that reminds you that God sees you and He loves you. God is so good at pursuing us, even when we're wandering around doing our own thing. And I'm grateful for that today. One of the times for me that I was kind of in a wandering season was my freshman year of college. And the school that I attended, they had this special program for freshmen. When you showed up, they put you in a peer group of 12 to 15 people. And there was a senior at the school that oversaw your peer group, and they organized a bunch of activities for you to do together. Moment of frankness, I hated that. I hated everything about it because I already had some friends back home. I wasn't in a good spot in my own life, and I didn't care to meet 12 other people that I didn't know and build relationship with them. So that's just kind of where I was at. And so they put us in this peer group, and they took us on all these adventures to build relationships and build community. And I just thought to myself, whatever, I don't care about this. And one of the trips that they took us on was to this farm in northern Michigan called Cedar Bend. It's a place that you could go today. And it's this farm that's kind of secluded out in the middle of nowhere. There's no cell phone reception. There's no internet. There's no TV. There's nothing on this farm. It's very, very rustic. And so they unplug you from everything that you know, everything that makes sense to you, with 12 strangers for 3 days. It's horrific. I mean, like, think about the most awkward thing that you've ever been a part of and multiply that by like 10. You're in this space with 12 people you don't know for 3 days with nothing else to do but to stare at each other and like ask questions to each other. It was really weird. But good, mind you. It was a good thing, but my perspective at the time was, this is horrible. Please, I want to go home. Like, I hate every minute of this. And the second night of the trip, I left where we were sleeping about 11:30 at night, and I walked out to this chapel that was on the campus. I got a picture of it. They had it online. And so I walked out to this chapel in the middle of the night, and I sat down in one of those really uncomfortable pews, and I had a lot to tell God that night. I cried out to God, and I was like, is this punishment? For like the way I've been living? Are you trying to punish me for my behavior by bringing me to this place? And I had a lot to tell God that night. And after a while of venting, I just felt like the Lord told me or spoke to me and said, "Why are you running from me?" And 20 minutes later or so, Dave Knight, the guy who was my peer advisor, showed up, and we began a conversation well into the middle of the night about hearing the voice of God and responding to Him when He calls you. And I'm so grateful for moments like that I was in the right time at the right place with the right people. I didn't even want to be there, but that's where God met me. And sometimes it takes being taken out of everything that you understand, the places that make sense to you, the connections that you have in order to hear from the Lord. It takes being disconnected in order to pay attention to what he's saying. I don't know if you found that true in your life. It's definitely been true in mine. And that's kind of what we're experiencing with the Israelites. They weren't in a great situation. They were in slavery in Egypt, but God delivers them from slavery in Exodus, and then he takes them out into the desert to a place where they don't have any connections or things that make sense or things that they know. I mean, what they knew was bad, but they still knew what each day looked like. Now they're in the desert with a bunch of people, and they're learning to trust God. They're learning to really hear from God. They're learning to obey God. That's what's happening in the desert, and it's a very, very uncomfortable situation for them. We're going to continue into Numbers 14. So if you have a Bible, pull that out. If you have a smartphone, feel free to pull that out as well. There's no guilt for having your phone here today. Many of you read on your phone. Chapter 14, we read chapter 13 last week. And so we're going to stay right in the same story. But here's what happened in 13. Here's what we discussed last week. We talked about the story of the Israelites and the fact that they had a past. That's rocket science. Everybody has a past. But they had a past, and their past included their time in Egypt where they were slaves. It included many, many challenges in that 400 plus years of being slaves. It also included promises that were given to them, to their people. That God would bless them and multiply them and make them a great nation. And so their past was filled with all kinds of things. In their past, looking in the rearview mirror, they had God show up to them in some very, very powerful ways, miraculous ways, delivering them from Egypt, providing food for them in the desert, food and water. I mean, there's some powerful acts of God in their past that were a part of their shared story. And then God was taking them somewhere. He had this promise for them. It's called the Promised Land in the text that we're reading, but this is where God was taking them. He had promised them a place, a land, and he was going to take them there. That was what the Lord told them. And where we find them is in this space in between the past and the promise. They're wrestling with, what does it look like to follow God right now? Not back then. What did it look like then, or what is it going to look like? But what does it mean to be a person of God right now? What does it look like to listen and respond, to hear and obey today? This is what they're working through. This is what they're learning how to do in the desert. And we're going to continue Numbers 14, where they're at this crossroads where they're trying to figure out, how do we respond in this gap between the past and the promise? Do we move forward in faith, or do we respond in fear to what's in front of us? And at the end of chapter 13, what we read last week is that the spies that went into this land to check it out came back and spread a bad report. There was horrible land, and the people were huge, and that we were grasshoppers in their sight, and the land devours people. So there's fear spreading throughout the camp. Let's pick up in 14. The story continues, verse 1. It says, "Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, 'Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land of fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?' And they said to one another, 'Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt.'" So in this first section, we witness what happens to a people who are gripped by fear. There's a couple things I want to highlight here. First, when fear guides us, we trust our perspective. We trust our perspective. Last week, we made clear that when the spies went into the promised land, they weren't making up that there was enemies in the land. that their cities were fortified. There was very real obstacles, so they were not making that up. But here's what the spies did. When they went in and they looked at the land and they realized these guys are huge and their cities are fortified, they came back to their people and they began to evaluate their size and their abilities and their strengths. And when they matched up what they had versus what they had, you know what the response was, what their conclusion was? We're going to die. We're going to die. They evaluated the situation and they said, they're big, they're going to eat us. The land's going to devour us. We're like grasshoppers to them. And they put their trust in their perspective. They evaluated the situation and said, there's no way. And it got worse because they didn't just say that. They said, God must be wanting to kill us. God must be trying to kill us. Why? Why couldn't we have just died in Egypt? Why can't we just die here in the wilderness? When we observe our situations through fear, we trust our perspective. Based on what we see, we make an evaluation about our strengths and our abilities, and we make some decisions. And the problem is God is actually removed from the whole story when we do that. Anyone good at this? Evaluating your situation and kind of taking God out of the picture? Like you just evaluate your own strength versus God's strength in situations? You look at obstacles, you look at difficulties, you look at challenges, and you go, there's no way. I'd say we're all really good at this. And here's why, because this is how we succeed in life. We succeed in life by evaluating a situation, by making a decision, and moving forward. And when you do that really, really well, you get a job promotion, and you get more money. Am I wrong? This is how our world operates. Those that are able to use wisdom, and it's not a bad thing, those that are able to use wisdom, evaluate a situation, look at their strengths, look at what they're facing, and say, this is what's going to happen, those are the ones that are elevated. We trust their perspective. And the more we make decisions where we're trusting our perspective, again, it's not a horrible thing, but here's what happens. We begin to trust our perspective a little too much, and we move God farther and farther out of the equation. It's all about what we see. It's all about what we can do. We actually tend to live like we don't need God at all. Or we never face things that God's asking us to face because we're too scared based on our abilities. God was teaching his people how to trust him. He'd take them into the desert and he was showing them, listen, I want you to know you can trust me, that your enemies that seem so big to you are nothing to me. And I'll take you where I want to take you. A couple years ago, Katie and I were praying about just what was next for us. And we had the opportunity to pray about coming up here to Living Word. And to make a long story short, I'd be lying to you if I said that fear didn't have us by the throat for a long time. Because we looked at this community, a community that we've loved from a distance for a long time. We've been connected to, Tim and I have been friends for 7-8 years through youth ministry. And this community is amazing. Not just in this area, but like in our movement. This is a highly respected place. And there just happened to be a very highly respected, incredible leader that is very, very valued in our denomination, Russ Schlecht. And before him, who's now our district supervisor, Dave Veach, pastored this church for 20 years. So there's zero pressure at all to come into this role. None. We didn't feel that at all. Like, no big deal. And we prayed about it, and we knew that it was the next step for us. But I'll tell you what, we're not here because we felt like we were strong enough to do this job. No, I have schooling. I can tell you things that I have, but it's not about what strength I bring here. Here's the thing. God is so faithful to his people. He said he's going to build his church. And the gates of Hades, there's nothing that's going to stop him doing his work. And what I've seen for the last year is God do exactly that. He's been faithful to build his church, to build his people. And we get to be a part of that. Fear had us by the throat. And if fear guides our life, we just stay stuck right where we are. We don't make any steps of faith. We don't step out at all. Why would we? Fear does that to us. The second thing that we see in this story is that when fear is guiding, we fantasize about the past. I know that no one ever does this here, but just imagine your friend that does this. When you're facing a challenge or you're facing a difficulty, you start thinking about how great things were back then, or how great things could be somewhere else. How great it was when this, how awesome it was back. We all do it. When we face difficulties, we do this. And for the Israelites, this isn't the first time that we've seen them do this. They've done this regularly through the whole story. When they've run into difficulty, when they run into challenge, what do? Oh, we should just go back to Egypt. Let's return back to where we were. Why would God bring us out here? Is he trying to kill us? They want to return because what was in front of them seemed too big. And this is so true of us. Instead of facing obstacles in front of us and moving forward into the promises God has for us, when we reach that hurdle, when we reach that obstacle, we begin to go, I just want to go backwards. I don't want to go forward anymore. We had a youth leader in our group probably 5 or 6 years ago, and loved this guy. He's just full of life and so fun to be around. And he was so good at making commitments. Like just jumping in. I'm all in. Whatever we had. Like, hey, we need somebody to mop the floors everywhere. I'll do it. Hey, we need somebody to lead this retreat or help with these students. I'll do it. He was really great at jumping in, but he was really horrible at following through on anything that he was given. Because whenever something got hard, he always looked for something else to commit to. And I remember sitting with him in the courtyard of our church, and he was getting ready to move to California because that was going to change his life. Everything was going to be different. Everything was going to be better. And I sat with him in our courtyard and I said, do you realize that you are taking you down to California? The things that you're avoiding here, you're probably going to try to avoid down there. I don't think being in a different location is really going to help you out. He wasn't happy with what I said to him. I'll just say that. But he kind of took it to heart. He went to California, was there for 2 years, and came back. I don't need to say, Katie knows who I'm talking about. Dear friend, I don't have any harsh things towards him, but it was interesting to watch that happen. How many of us do the same thing? We face something difficult. I'll just go this way or that way or backwards because I don't want to deal with what's right in front of me. I don't want to deal with what's happening in here. So I'll do something else. We all do that. For the Israelites, they thought, let's go back to the past, which, mind you, was 400 years of slavery. Like the fact that they're fantasizing about that just tells you how twisted their minds had become. Let's go back to Egypt. It was better there. Are you kidding me? It was horrible. Yet they thought it was better than what they had to face in the future. Last thing that we see when fear guides us is we find people to support our ideas. This is a tough one. This is like, They say, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Moses, who was given the task of leading them, was just doing what the Lord told him to do. He was taking them to the promised land. And they decide, it's too difficult, forget Mo, let's find someone else to take us where we want to go. I know that's what God's telling us to do. We don't want to do that. Anybody want to lead us back there? Because that's where we want to go. They left behind God's plan and God's purpose for them to support what they wanted to do. Again, here's what I witnessed in my own life. If I feel like God is asking me to do something that is far beyond me, my first response can be to try to find people that will encourage me and justify me to stay right where I am. Somebody just pat my back and tell me it's okay. That I don't have to face what I'm supposed to face. Just tell me it's okay. I assume the laughter or the silence is because this is something we face. We all do it. I'll give you an example from marriage. With my wife sitting in the front row. Let's say there was a fictitious couple. And let's say this couple got into an argument at one point. And it became a doozy of an argument. Like, wow, what's happening right now? Now, we've got a couple options. We may have faced a couple of those. If this fictitious characters were Katie and I, let's just take that as an example that it could be. We both have a couple of options in this scenario. We could begin to look inward and address what's going on internally that's maybe causing the issue. Or, which we're always guilty of, I think everyone could relate to this, we go to our buddies or we go to our girlfriends and we begin to share how horrible our spouse is. And they pat us on the back and say, oh, it's okay, you're so right, she's just mean, or he's just mean, or... Now, does that create intimacy in a relationship? What does that do? I mean, it sends you running opposite directions. Now, that's a marriage example, but this is like a life example. We do this with everything. When we face something difficult, if we don't want to work through it, we try to find support. We find support for our ideas and our beliefs. Somebody pat me on the back where I am so I don't have to deal with what I need to deal with. And amazing thing is, God is so faithful with the Israelites to keep prodding them, keep leading them, keep encouraging them forward because he loves them. He doesn't want them to stay in the past. He doesn't even want them to stay in the present. He wants them to go into the promised land. And he's willing to do that work on his people. He's willing to do that work on us. Anybody ready to receive some of that from the Lord today? He desires to do that work in us. Okay, let's move forward now. Numbers 14, verse 5. That was fear. Let's look at what faith looks like. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. We'll just call him JP. Who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. By the way, it's okay to do that. If you come to a name in Scripture, just give him a nickname. It's like a bro, like JP. I must be getting tired. Okay. Where was I? It said to the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Then all the congregation said, to stone them with stones. But the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they. Whew. Let's look at how faith guides Joshua and Caleb, because these two guys, they were different than the rest. There's only a couple of them, but how did they respond? When faith guides us, we trust in God's plan. It seems simple, but it's very profound. God told them that he was going to take them into the promised land. That was the plan. And those who walked in faith, Joshua and Caleb, believed God at his word, that he could do that, even with the obstacles standing in the way. The promised land that they were entering into, it wasn't just about this land that they were walking into. There was a work that God was doing on his people so they could be the kind of people that could inhabit the land. Because if the people didn't trust God in this in-between space, between the past and the promise, if they had a hard time trusting God's voice and believing that he's faithful, what makes you think that they would do it in the promised land? So the work that happens in this in-between space for you and I, for the Israelite people, is the most important work because it's preparing us to live there. There's a work that's happening underneath the surface, and having faith is about standing between these two things and trusting that God is faithful to complete the work he starts. He's good that way. He's doing a work in each of us, and he's faithful to complete it. When faith guides us, we trust in God's plan. Second, when faith guides us, we rely on God's presence. Joshua and Caleb say, the land's ours, the Lord is with us. They were able to grasp that God wasn't telling them, hey, why don't you go ahead and head into the promised land and see if you can beat those guys, and I'll just kind of watch. Maybe you'll make it. Could be fun. He was saying, I'm going with you there. The presence of God was in the middle of their camp in the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted, they moved. When the cloud settled, they settled. They were learning to trust the presence of God in the midst of their camp. And if God's presence was going to take them there, then they'd be okay. Joshua and Caleb trusted this. They said, if God said he's going there, I'm going to trust that his presence will be with us and he will deliver us. He will conquer our enemies. Because they'd already seen this happen. Again, we looked at this last week. Like, they didn't leave Egypt because they decided, hey, it's time to leave Egypt. Let's beat these guys up and leave. God showed up. The presence of God came and showed his power through plagues to deliver them and then feed them and give them water. This is all about God's presence. He's the one that cared for them. He's the one that delivered them. Joshua and Caleb put their hope. They trusted in this. They relied on God's presence. What's funny in the end of chapter 14, it's not funny. It's actually horribly not funny at all. Sorry. It's bad. In the end of chapter 14, the people are told, listen, guys, you haven't trusted me, and you've kind of settled on not trusting me. So you know what's going to happen? You're going to die in the desert. And you want to know how they respond? Oh, okay. Well, okay, we're ready now. If you'd have just said that, we're ready to go into the promised land now. And yet they're warned, don't go now. Why? Because the presence of God isn't going to be with you. And so, true to their form, they decide to not listen yet again. And they move into the promised land when they're told not to. And they're crushed because the presence of God wasn't with them. So a life of faith is trusting in God's plan, but relying fully on his presence. Only go where he goes. Follow him. He's the one that provides the strength and the courage to face what you need. And the last thing that we see when faith guides us is that we experience God's covering. Verse 10, when all the congregation said to stone them with stones. So they decide, hey, this Joshua and Caleb guy are really getting on my nerves because I want to go back there, and yet they keep trying to encourage people to go forward. Let's pick up rocks and throw it at them until they die. That's what being stoned with stones means. That's what they're saying. Let's kill these guys because they're affecting what we want to do. God shows up. The glory of the Lord appeared. Now, when I was a middle schooler, I was very tiny. So I made a very strategic move to make friends with the largest humans I could find. And here's why I did this. Because if things ever went south for little old Drew, I would have the biggest guys in my class to cover me. Worked out pretty well. There was this guy he was 6'6" in like 7th grade. Like, you're a freak of nature. I am not that big. But we became friends, and he had my back, and it was awesome. Can you imagine the glory of God showing up on your behalf? I mean, they're about to get killed. These guys are rising up to kill them. And it says, the glory of the Lord appeared. What a confidence booster for these men of faith. Hey, you guys want to go? Check out the glory of God. Come at me, bro. I mean, this is what's happening right now. Joshua and Caleb understood. I mean, and This is what happens when you walk in faith and God shows himself faithful. Your faith grows. You realize when you're facing challenges, when you're facing difficulty, and with many of you, we've walked through very challenging things this year. Doesn't mean that you haven't faced obstacles. Doesn't mean you haven't gone through difficulty. Doesn't mean you haven't had a lot of hurt and pain. But when you're walking in faith, there's a covering that happens that you are able to endure because you know God has you. He's holding you. There's a covering that happens when we walk in faith. We all need it. Joshua and Caleb experienced the glory of the Lord, and maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but this is a cool illustration of what happens when we walk in faith. And they were swimming upstream, people. They were not the majority. And they were only the couple of guys that actually made it into the promised land because they stood this way. I'm going to invite the worship team to come as we close. I want to read one more passage from Hebrews. Hebrews 4. This is a passage that's speaking about what we just read in Numbers, the story of Israel. And so thousands of years later in the New Testament, they're reflecting on the Old Testament story. And here's what the author of Hebrews says. He says, God's promise of entering his rest still stands. So we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listened to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. Those who believe enter rest. Here's my prayer for us. We'd take a step of faith, that we would believe. That we wouldn't get stuck wanting to run into the past. That we wouldn't even get stuck in the present, but that we would move forward in faith. Believing in the Word of God, believing in the promises of God, trusting in his Word, trusting in his grace and his presence with us. If you feel like you're stuck in this present right now, or if you feel like you're stuck running to the past, I pray that the Spirit of God would come on you today. And he'd give you what you need to move forward. Let's pray. Lord, we invite you into this place. We thank you that you're already here. That's the story. You were pursuing before we even asked. You've given us your Spirit. We ask for the courage to respond yes and amen to whatever you're leading us into, whatever you're asking us to face, whatever obstacle you're calling us to overcome. We thank you that you're here with us, to walk with us.